Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. And today we, of course, will look at some of the chaos and some of the uncertainty that surrounds the latest development on the trade and tariff front. The deadline for a deal has passed, but it seems as if trade talks will sort of continue in some way or another. President Trump imposed higher tariffs, but on a small number of goods, because most of the goods that we trade are still protected by the existing free trade deal, and things like steel and aluminum and copper are sort of in a different category. So we are going to try and make some sense of this so that you can all rest and not be too concerned about the uncertainty and the chaos, although if you're in the business world, you're doing a lot of paperwork. We have turned, as we always do, to Trevor Tombe. He is a professor of economics at the University of Calgary, research fellow at the School of Public Policy. And this is, I love this, so I always mention it. He's the co-director of finances of the nation. And this is a project where they kind of pull together all the financial data that is publicly available, but which is mostly incomprehensible to the real world and to students and to researchers. So that's God's work you're doing there, trying to make that. So Trevor, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's walk through it. So to be clear, the 35% tariff is not 35% new. It is a move from 25 to 35. So what's the real impact of that?
Yeah, that's an important point. So this executive order that the United States and President Trump released yesterday, so we're talking on August
Yeah.
1st. So on July 31st, they released an executive order stating that because, in their words, Canada's lack of cooperation on stemming the flood of fentanyl, again, just quoting them, and because of Canada's retaliations against the United States, what they've done is increased the tariff that was previously set at 25% on non-free trade imports into the US. They've increased that to 35%. So it's a 10 percentage point change in tariffs that have been in place by the United States for now several months.
Yeah.
And importantly, that tariff, both before at 25 and now at 35, don't apply to imports into the United States that are compliant with the rules of origin of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. And most of what Canada sells into the United States is compliant with that trade agreement.
90%, I think we're talking about the goods and services that are covered by
Yeah, that's some of the estimates that we've heard. The data has some lag. A lot of data does have lag. The most recent data point is May, at which time just under 60% of exports. So I'd say that, 80-90% is probably a good estimate of how much of what we sell to the US now is probably compliant with the trade agreement. So for those exporters, nothing changed as a result of this executive order.
Even the paperwork, because if you have to fill out the paperwork and document your supply chains, like where the steel comes from and where the screws come from and all of that, you've had to do that paperwork anyway. It's just the end number has changed.
Yeah, so interestingly, some sectors, if we think back to last year or years previously, pulp and paper exporters, as an example from Canada, the US default tariff rate was 0. So there was really no preferential access under the free trade agreement because you wouldn't be charged anything anyway. So firms naturally didn't bother to go through and have those compliance certificates. And yes, having the tracking and the systems and filling out the necessary forms and so on, there's costs associated with that for businesses. So I don't want to say there's no burden
right
here. But most exporters, the overwhelming majority, are able to satisfy those compliance requirements. And it's certainly better than paying their 35% tariff.
And the other reason, because people are often puzzled why he keeps talking about fentanyl, and there are good reasons. Some of it exists, but this is the this is the rubric under which he has imposed tariffs, that there has to be an extreme security threat to the nation. So he keeps saying that over and over again, although he's probably more angry about the prime minister's comments on a Palestinian state than he is about anything else.
Well, it's of course tough to say what the underlying motivation
Yeah.
is behind, in any government's policy choice, and perhaps uniquely
Right.
tricky with President Trump. But yes, the legal justification of these tariffs is under the U.S. International Emergency Economic Powers Act,
Right.
and that allows the president to adopt trade policy changes, including tariff changes or including outright complete sanctions. If there's an emergency. And the stated emergency is the both fentanyl flows and cross-border migration issues. Now, there are some legal challenges in the United States
Yeah, for
launched
sure.
by U.S. businesses around the legality of this, and that'll be a really interesting thing to watch. But of course, that process is quite slow. And so at the
Yeah.
moment, the stated rationale, and we see this again throughout the executive order yesterday, is that emergency declaration largely centered on illicit drugs.
Yeah, and the border. All right, so let us look at some other things. The steel and the aluminum, the copper sort of sitting there as is, still a big issue for us. Obviously, the auto sector is quite concerned as well. Again, we're doing this in the context of everybody can read and watch the news that we watched Ottawa fund a project in British Columbia to buy ferries from
Mm.
China, made, using no Canadian steel, no Canadian aluminum, this kind of deal going forward and funded in part by the feds. So does that kind of put us in a bit of an awkward position when it comes to having discussions about those two things in particular?
Well, I can appreciate in general that sometimes it's hard for governments to move quickly. They are very large entities, and so the pace of change that we're seeing internationally, the changes in tariffs, the changes in the circumstances facing Canadian steel and aluminum producers. I don't want to be too hard on the BC government or BC ferries. These contract decisions were probably taken some time ago, and suspect they'll
Fair
probably
enough. Yeah.
also maybe be, changing some of that, and we'll probably see that in the days or weeks to come. But yeah, what we see in steel and aluminum, which export a lot to the United States, they're subject now to a 50% tariff. And
Yeah.
that's not just targeting Canadian steel and aluminum. This is a broader global policy, legally levied in the United States under a very different power than the tariff that is targeting Canada related to fentanyl. So a very different situation. But that's one where there's no exemption to those that are even compliant with the free trade agreement with the United States. And so that's a much more damaging tariff for that sector than the broad 35% tariff that we were talking about earlier. Now, how governments respond to this will be quite difficult. So, on the one hand, there might be direct financial support, certainly
Mhm.
to displaced workers, but maybe even direct to affected businesses. And some of that might be funded from the retaliatory tariffs that Canada has been levying now for many months, which are roughly speaking bringing in just shy of $1 billion a month. And so there
Yeah.
is some dollars that they can use from that. But it's going to be very difficult. Support in the short term is one thing, but what happens long term if these US tariffs remain in place is quite another.
It seems in a lot of the discussions and conversations I've been listening to today that because the deadline for a renegotiation of NAFTA 2.0, CUSMA as it's called, or
Mm.
USMCA, depending on what country you're standing in, that starts fairly quickly anyway. I mean, really, I'm sure those discussions are already underway. So it's almost as if eventually these things will have to merge. And maybe that's why, Mexico got its 90-day delay. It was kind of quiet on that issue with us at this point. So maybe that's sort of what's going on behind the scenes. Any thoughts on that?
Well, there's almost surely a lot going on
Yeah.
behind the scenes, no doubt about it. And why Mexico received a 90-day delay, but Canada did not, I think that's a very important and interesting question that I certainly don't know the answer to,
Well,
but
the
well,
Americans have answered that to some degree, which is they didn't impose retaliatory tariffs and they were nicer, to quote the president.
yeah. So the retaliation is a point explicitly mentioned in the executive order,
Yeah.
and no question. And Canada and China are kind of unique in
Yeah.
actually retaliating on the U.S. And I think we've had a conversation on that before. That I think it's largely counterproductive and imposes additional costs on Canada's economy when it can least afford it. But I guess we can
We'll
put that
note
aside.
that again. Yeah.
Yeah, it's worth noting because
Yes.
we wouldn't want to follow through with additional retaliatory measures from this 35% tariff. And to his credit, the prime minister hasn't signaled that that's something that they have planned, which is good. And we'll see if that
Yeah, because there are some
changes.
sectors calling for that, but I mean, then you really get into tit for tat.
Exactly. And the trouble for Canada is, manifold in this case. Relative to the United States, we're quite small. And so tariffs that we levy are largely, almost entirely absorbed by Canadian consumers. So it's not something where it's satisfying the goal of retaliation, which would be to hurt the U.S. economy somehow.
Exactly.
And so our tariffs we levy on ourselves can't really do that to the same degree that a large country levying tariffs can potentially shift some of a meaningful amount of the burden of that tariff onto producers abroad. But small countries
Well,
doesn't
and we
work the
saw the
same way.
prime minister lift some of those retaliatory tariffs even before the election campaign was over, for that precise reason. It's cutting off your nose to spite your face. It hurts us.
Indeed. And so I think, although I'm reading between the lines here, that the prime
Yeah.
minister completely understands all
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
what we've been
Yeah.
saying. There's just some non-economic considerations, let's say, for a
Exactly.
government to walk back on previous policy choices.
So when the prime minister put out his statement and we were having this discussion that maybe it's just a question of bad grammar. He's talking about strengthening and diversifying our trading partnerships, but he also said Canadians will be our own best customer, which led me to kind of shake my head and say, if we were, we wouldn't be doing trade deals, but we have to because we're an export nation. I think he was probably referencing internal trade and internal trade barriers in this country,
Hmm.
but we're in a bit of a bind. I mean, we watched the European Union sign a huge, big, significant deal. The details we don't know, but the
Right.
one thing we do know is they promised to buy $750 billion worth of American energy. When the Europeans asked us for help, we said no business case. So, we're in this situation and we've got that one customer. So we sell it to the US for, I don't know, call it $1 and they can sell it to the Europeans for 5.
Yeah.
Um, we don't get much action out of that.
Well, a couple things to unpack there. So let me start with the EU deal. So this is
Yeah.
one that relative to the arrangement Canada currently has, even under the new 35% tariff announced yesterday and in effect as of now, the EU situation is worse because so much of our exports are able to enter the United States
Yeah.
still tariff free under the free trade
Correct.
agreement that,
Right.
that we have. So the deal that the EU is not something that we should hope for. A 15% tariff on everything with only a couple specific carves out is far
Yeah, no, I
worse
agree. It's the
than what we
energy
have
thing
now.
specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's,
And
yeah.
so the commitments around the EU buying a lot of energy from the United States or committing to invest a lot into the United States, that's a really interesting part of the deal because I think it's largely just there to satisfy a communications objective or a
Oh,
political
no,
objective
no
on the part of the
question.
government. I mean, Canada we already invest so much into the United States every single year. I think in 2023, which is the most recent data, I don't think we have 2024 out yet. I could be mistaken. We invested about $400 billion in
Yeah.
a single year. So if we came out with an arrangement that said Canada will invest into the United States $1 trillion, wow, what a headline that would be.
Yeah.
But it's basically just 2.5 years of normal normal
But you see,
flows
that is kind
between
of
the
the
two
point,
economies.
Trevor. We're not making that case. We're not saying it publicly because there
Yeah.
seems to be just some resistance to doing what everybody else is doing as long as Donald Trump can stand up and say he's got to win. Everybody uses the obvious and lets him say that. And
Yeah.
we're kind of resisting for no apparent gain.
Yeah.
Um,
That is a very interesting observation, and I guess I'll leave it to others with the expertise on how to
yeah.
win a public relations battle to someone else
Yeah.
with that expertise. But I've long been saying that, we need to highlight how much we invest in the United States already, and if it means saying, thanks to Donald Trump, we invest the X
Right.
$100 billion, well, then we should go ahead and say that.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, this does have real implications on Canadians when US policy changes, especially when it changes in
Right.
a chaotic way, because uncertainty affects investment and that affects employment and jobs and incomes within Canada. And yeah, if that means that we have to make certain statements that don't feel all that good when it's being made, well, it may very well avoid what could be more damaging
Yeah,
US
because our
policy. And we've seen this
priority.
from, I guess, the UK Prime Minister Keir
Yes.
Starmer has been,
Right.
I guess many have been critical, and I can appreciate that, but he's clearly trying to avoid the worst of US trade policy against the United Kingdom. And relative to what the EU had in their deal, it looks like he's succeeded.
Yep. No, and I think that's it. That actually the end game is to protect Canadian businesses and Canadian citizens, and so we should think about that and put egos aside a little bit. But anyways, so I want to touch on a couple of other things, which is you, I think, I think it was this week you wrote a piece about another one of the sore points between Canada and US is supply management and dairy, which we have again passed legislation to say we will not put this on the table. We won't negotiate
Mhm.
it. And it's something that the Americans have long sought for. Where do you think we're at on that? Do you think that was again more posturing and positioning? And then secondly, what's your fundamental concern with this?
Yeah, supply management's an interesting one because it is something that President Trump does raise fairly regularly. It
Yeah.
wasn't explicitly pointed out in this executive order yesterday, unless I missed it, but I don't believe so.
No, because that's not under the emergency rubric. Yeah.
Yeah. Although he mentioned Canadian supply management on Liberation Day back in April,
Oh, you
even though
bet.
Canada
Yeah.
was not included then. So he kind of
Yeah.
raises it randomly every now
Yeah.
and then for understandable reasons. I mean, there are major dairy producers that are swing states in the US, Wisconsin in particular. And so a president is naturally going to be sensitive to that particular issue. But far beyond the United States, New Zealand is also not a fan of Canada's policy here. And it
Mhm.
creates real challenges for Canada to deepen our trading relationships with other countries when we are so protectionist in a sector that, frankly, we're not particularly competitive in. And so we need these large international tariffs in order to support domestic production of milk in particular, but other items as well. And so it damages our international relationships, not just with the United States.
Yeah.
And so it is an extremely costly policy to maintain, not just because it increases the price of groceries by several $100s a year for Canadians, which is a particular burden on low income Canadians. And so it's just bad domestic policy, but it's also this friction that we have with many other countries, not just the United States. Now, if the US wanted to really push it, and it's hard to know if they are or will,
Yeah.
then it would be something that we would have to really think very hard about dismantling as a system. We saw that with the digital services tax. Also, something
Exactly.
that I think was unwise domestic policy
In the first place,
in
that's
the
it.
first place,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
trading relationships aside.
Yes.
Yeah. And we walked that back under pressure from the United States. And so at the end of the day, I suspect, despite the rhetoric, that a federal government would not jeopardize the entire Canadian economy in order to protect a very, very small handful of now largely corporate interests in dairy production
Yeah.
within Canada. And how,
Primarily in
how
Quebec, which is, of course, always the reason
creates a
because,
political challenge for sure.
the
Um,
politics is always underneath there. Yeah.
and the politics here is I think important to think about because there is a way out of it, I think, in a way that doesn't lead to um, you know, undue damage on dairy producers. Many of them have invested considerable amounts in the quotas that are required to produce milk in the first place. And these
Yeah.
quotas are not cheap. Something on the order of equivalent to what a cow can produce is about $25,000 for your quota in Ontario and I believe also Quebec, and about 50,000 per cow equivalent in Alberta.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about many, many tens of billions of dollars potentially in total value of these quotas. And the value would drop to zero if we just abandoned supply management, full stop,
Yeah.
cold turkey.
Yeah. No, no,
E-
there'd have to be transition for sure.
Exactly. And the
Yeah.
transition, other countries have done this. New Zealand comes to mind, Australia as well. I encourage people to read a great paper from the director of the School of Public Policy here, Martha Hall Finley, that was written
Ah,
about 10 years ago now, and is as important or more important now than it was then. And the simple transition here could be something where we levy a tax on milk. And we use the revenue from that tax to compensate farmers for the lost quota value. And that might not sound great, like, oh, a tax on
yeah.
milk, but there's a way to have the tax be actually less than the cost we're implicitly paying right now in the form of more expensive milk because of the supply management system. So there is a win-win where we can compensate producers for lost quotas and consumers can win. And then over the period of some time, and I believe Australia was a 10-year period, we're
Okay.
transitioning to this
Yeah.
much more competitive, much stronger sector, although probably a smaller one and lower cost milk and other items for consumers. So we can't just keep pretending like the current
Yeah.
system is not a problem. It's a problem for consumers. It's a problem for our partners, not just the United States.
Well, and the
And we
other
need to
thing
think
that,
about how to get out of this problem. And the sooner we can move, the better.
and the thing that drives me crazy, and I know thousands of other people, is when we watch hundreds and thousands of gallons of milk, for example, being dumped because they've produced over quota. And when kids aren't eating, somehow that just seems really crazy.
Well, that's the nature of how we can keep the price high is by
Yes,
restricting
exactly.
production and supply, and that's what quotas do. And so it
Yep.
is absolutely quite perverse when we're literally destroying food to keep the price of food high. This is the kind of thing that if we think back to our high school history lessons, most of us learned about this during the Great Depression when there
Yeah.
was similar policies to try and increase agricultural prices in the US in particular. And it's just quite perverse.
Yeah.
And there are ways forward that benefit consumers, compensate farmers, improve our ability to deepen trading relationships elsewhere, which now more than ever should be a priority.
You, of course, write about this on a daily basis, but and we don't really know the real numbers because we don't yet have a budget. We may get one in the fall, but the rough numbers are that the government is kind of poised to post a massive deficit of more than
Mm.
$90 billion during the fiscal year. Um, and I think you noted in your comments that we've also promised to up defense spending. The Carney government has promised some tax cuts. They've promised new programs, and debt servicing alone is I think 35 billion price tag, which is what you were saying. Anyway, these costs are there. They're going to continue to grow. So too might the $92 billion. I'm highlighting this because in the context of what we're discussing here, the cost of everything from supply management to other tariffs on businesses, this is like we're heading into pretty troubled economic waters, it feels like.
I'd agree for the simple reason that tariffs are obviously going to slow the pace of Canadian economic growth just because of how much of what we do is tied to export into the United States. But the dramatic rise in uncertainty is leading large scale investment in many sectors to prudently be paused until some of this uncertainty is resolved. And investment is a critical source of labor productivity growth and therefore economic growth. And so
Yeah.
a slowdown in growth this year, we're seeing it already. Labor market weakening, the number of job vacancies
Right.
falling, unemployment, therefore, as a result, rising. And that creates challenges for Canadians, certainly those affected by them, but it also creates fiscal challenges, as you noted, for the government. So the PBO baseline projection from just a few months ago for the deficit for this year was, I believe, $47 billion. And
Wow.
now we're looking at over 90 from analysis produced, I should say, credit where due, from the C.D. Howe Institute,
Yeah.
Don Drummond, Bill Robson, and Alex Loren there, who went through and added up all of the changes we've seen since the tax reduction on personal income, the cancellation of the digital services tax, the GST cut to home buyers, the capital gains tax change, increases in defense spending, plus nearly $30 billion in platform commitments put out by the Liberal Party in the past campaign, debt service costs, and so much more, led to a $92 billion deficit this year and staying above 80 in each of the next three after that, for a cumulative total deficit over these 4 years of $343 billion. And that's up from 142. So just more than 200 billion more borrowed dollars over
This
the
is
coming 4
staggering.
years. And when, as staggering as that may sound, when we look ahead and we think about what's the next decade have in store for us, we're growing military spending. I'm not a military expert, so I shouldn't really
Yeah.
say, but it seems as though we should. And we've made this
Yes, and we have
commitment to
commitments to do
allies
so.
abroad. So
Yeah.
of course we will follow through. A very different international security environment, but growing military spending across NATO allies, core military to 3.5% of GDP, plus an additional 1.5% of GDP on capacity building and support of military operations. And so let's just think about the 3.5% increase from our current now 2 and up pretty recently from 1.6% of GDP. That growth in military spending alone is, at least under the current fiscal projections that I've been putting together and releasing through some writings at the Hub, is going to be fully debt financed. And we're going to see an increase in the debt to GDP ratio every year over the next decade unless we make some changes. And it's not something where the changes are just little tweaks here and there. You know, the government
Right.
talks about balancing the operational budget, or it talks about lowering operation spending by as much as potentially 15%. We've seen reporting on by 2028. And I don't want to knock those efforts. These are going to be important contributors, but they're way too small
Yeah, this is
relative
just hiving
to
off some things where you can show progress, like
exactly.
reducing the size of the civil service or something. But in the scheme of things, it's
Yeah.
pretty small potatoes. Yeah.
And to get a sense of scale here, I think it's important for Canadians to keep in mind what the federal government does with its finances. And it largely doesn't deliver programs to Canadians like provincial governments do it.
Right.
It largely transfers dollars to individuals, elderly through old age security and the guaranteed income supplement, to families with young kids through the Canada Child Benefit, to provinces through various transfers, and so on. So if you exclude, as both the government and opposition parties have, at least in the last campaign, said we're not going to touch the transfers to individuals or transfers to provinces. So if you take those out of the picture and you take the military spending out of the picture and you take debt service costs, like interest on our debt, out of the picture, because we can't default on that, so it has to be paid, you're basically left with about 1/3 of the federal budget. And if we were to balance over a 10-year horizon, so imagine balancing only in 2035, we'd have to cut something on the order of nearly 2/3 of all of the non-transfer, non-interest, non-military spending of the federal government, which I think is not feasible, right? It's just too large of a change. Think about all of the Indigenous funding.
No
So
politician will go there. We have these things called elections. Yeah.
Even in the 1990s, when we had pretty meaningful changes in fiscal policy and dramatic reductions in spending, it wasn't the Indigenous services component of the budget was insulated from all of that. So we do need to talk about transfers. Maybe we do need to talk about increasing the age of eligibility for old age security. Maybe we do need to talk about transfers to provinces and growing them more slowly, or perhaps rolling together all of the conditional grants that we've been rolling out over the past couple of years in support of many programs that are in provincial jurisdictions. Maybe roll that into a block grant, more flexibility for provinces, but in exchange for slightly fewer dollars. So we do need to think about the broader structure of the federal budget in order to sustainably finance just the military spending increase alone.
Yeah, and the Indigenous spending is roughly the equivalent of that, right?
That's right. Exactly.
So this and these dire numbers that you quite accurately present, and the problem with investment, and we know the impact of deficit financing, of spending with borrowed dollars, which we did like crazy during the pandemic, but do it on a daily basis. This at a time when we're supposed to be engaged in these new incredible projects under Bill C5, and we're going to have energy corridors, and we're going to, we don't really know the list because they've said they're not going to tell us, but this is not a climate that is going to attract those foreign investment dollars that are already running for cover in the US, because it's to their benefit to do it. They're going to be rewarded if they invest there and build a plant there and support a project there. And we don't have much on offer.
I think Canada's economy has a lot to offer, but you're right that there are challenges that we face. Some challenges beyond our control, right. The uncertainty, and that's just a reality of that Canada has gone throughout its very existence, that we're exposed to a lot of international shocks, whether economic, through commodity prices, or through policy changes elsewhere. But there's also a lot of challenges to the investment climate in Canada that are of our own making. And I think a lot of what we see in certain critical sectors, I think about mining activity, the Ring of Fire, we've been talking about that for how many years now, and no significant move there, largely because of the policy environment that exists, the lack of
the rules and regulations, and everybody says it. It doesn't matter who you ask. It's you've got us in a chokehold with your regulatory structure.
Indeed. And so what we saw with C5 is I think an obvious recognition by the government that the regulatory environment is not workable. And so they created a structure where we could carve out some projects out of some regulatory burdens to hopefully accelerate them. And I think we can think about applying that logic more broadly. Projects that make sense should go ahead with minimal interference by competing government agencies with different mandates, and competing governments with different interests, and things like the Port of Vancouver expansion, which are obviously in the national interest, and we can't trade more with other countries if we can't physically move goods in and out. But it took 10 years for that project to go ahead, even though it's a no-brainer. And it'll take many years more to actually complete the construction of that project. Port of Montreal right now also seeking to go through an expansion. And dare I say, it's going to eventually get the approval. Well, why not approve it? It's no brainer.
That's the thing.
Obvious that it should be expanded. It's a critical national project. Ring of Fire, what are the challenges there? Well, maybe it's an infrastructure question beyond just the regulation. And if so, great, let's build the road. Just move
Yeah.
forward, build it. And um, with oil and gas, I'm speaking to you from Alberta, a critical sector, not just for this province, but a critical one for nearly every province in the
Right
country
next
as a
door where
whole.
I am in Saskatchewan too, in the
And
same.
how do you, as an investor in this critically important sector, make a decision when you're facing so many barriers to
Yeah.
expansion, from the emissions cap in particular federally to challenges around infrastructure, pipelines in particular? So I think the federal government, if it's serious about increasing investment and increasing productivity and increasing growth, then it does need to dramatically reform a lot of the regulations that it has enacted over the past several years. And I know that's hard. Politically, it's
Yeah.
hard to balance all of this, but it's something that we clearly need to do. And it's a direction that they've already started moving with C5. We just need to recognize it's a bigger problem than just a couple hand-picked projects.
Well, that's the thing. There's conflicting messages because if you really, I was just at a conference talking to people in the mining sector, whether it's uranium or, potash, whatever it may be. It takes 15 to 19 years to get a mining project off the ground. Like this is insanity.
Yep.
So, C5 is one approach, which is let the government decide when it wants to change the rules or, exempt some things from law. But the signals could have been more helpful too if Bill 69 and Bill 48 and some other things had been lifted,
Yep.
because that's what the foreign investors in the industry have been struggling with. So
Exactly.
now they're still waiting on the largesse of Ottawa to say, oh, well, maybe we'll lift the restrictions on this project or that project, instead of saying, here's a signal, we're going to change the climate in which you're operating.
And I think that word signal is quite important. As I noted earlier, governments are big and it takes time. And, yes, it will take time. But if,
Yeah.
if you're going to signal to business, to investors, to Canadians that the future is going to be different and brighter and easier to do business in Canada, you could commit to saying, you know what, C69 is a problem. The emissions cap is a problem. Just
Problem. Yeah.
bluntly say it, but then
Yeah.
follow up by saying, we don't yet know what we're going to replace it with, but we commit to September or October.
Yeah.
We'll release something then, but like clearly signal where you're headed. And if you're signaling where you're headed is a much more sensible regulatory environment, that itself can help. But right now, it's kind of, you have to read between the lines to get the sense that they're probably going to reform some of these problematic bills. They just don't come right out and say it. And I think that's partly because of the communications and politics is really, they
Yeah.
haven't figured that out.
But investment decisions, multi-billion-dollar investment decisions, can't be based on kind of hopefully maybe reading between the lines. There actually has
Exactly.
to be a time frame.
Exactly. And that's why uncertainty leads to lower investment. We've lots of research has documented this, and it's quite an obvious connection. And uncertainty in Canada has risen to levels that we have never seen in recent decades. We have some measures on these that the details of which we don't need to get into, but a
Yeah.
clear spike in uncertainty over the past
Yeah.
year.
And with things, Donald Trump's so-called big, beautiful bill, I mean, he's put a lot of incentives in there for people who choose the US market over ours, write-offs and write-downs and all of those things. And we're not making any signals through our tax system either.
That's right. So tax changes in the states have improved their competitiveness relative to ours. Under the first tax bill, I believe it was passed in 2017 in the
Yeah.
US, we did respond with some changes of our own that didn't fully compensate for the US changes, but moved a little bit in recognition of the challenge with some accelerated write-offs that are important for investment decisions. And so far, we haven't done anything in response to the most recent bill
Yeah.
or even signaled that we're going to do anything. And this is where the government, if it doesn't want to take a decision now, right away, for the budget we're getting into the fall, well, they could appoint either a task force or a royal commission, which they committed to in their platform. Sorry, not a royal commission, but they committed to something to review the business tax competitiveness of Canada. If we do something really serious, and we've done this in the past before, I think about one chaired by Jack Mintz in the 1990s, put a serious group together to come up with some real meaningful tax changes for Canada so that it's ready for, say, the March 2026 budget, whenever they plan to release that. But the sooner we move, the better, because taxes are very important for investment decisions.
Yeah.
And there are ways to do it that are not going to break the bank fiscally. Like, there are a lot of smart reforms that can be done. There's also ways of broadening the tax base to lower tax rates. Right. So there's lots of clever ideas out there to improve the tax competitiveness of Canada. And the longer we wait to enact them, the bigger and bigger this economic gap between Canada and the US will get.
Well, especially with, the deficit and debt figures that you have laid out just to really ruin our weekend. But no, I'm kidding. It's important, people need to, it's hard to get your head around $92 billion, right?
And I guess I don't want to be pessimistic here. There are certainly a lot of challenges that Canada faces in the years ahead, but we also have a lot of options at our disposal. We just need to kind of, with a very hard head, get into exploring and enacting those solutions. Because the sooner we do that, the more gradual they can be, because a little bit compounded every year adds up to quite a bit. And so I am quite optimistic, just because Canada has many options to improve things. And long term, there's a lot working in Canada's favor. But we don't want to let these opportunities pass us by. Like, crises are a moment where Canadians are now kind of recognizing
the point. Instead of turning it into a fight with Donald Trump, let's turn it into unleashing our own energy and resources. I mean, energy in the largest sense, right? And
very well said. Yep.
Yeah, it's great. Always great to talk to you, Trevor. Thanks very much for your just injecting facts into this discussion. I think is really important too, and you always do that for us and in everything you write. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Trevor Tombe, Professor of Economics at the University of Calgary and Research Fellow at the School of Public Policy, and a long list of other things. And he writes an enormous amount of material. So find him on the Hub and other places, because you're really an important voice in this country at this time. So thanks to Trevor, and thanks to all of you for being part of our conversation today. We'll see you again very soon for another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wall. Bye for now.